Hi, I'm Timothy Jones, a pastor and an author. I'm here with Daniel Nayeri. Daniel, thank you for doing this interview for the Rabbit Room. I'm delighted to have this time with you. I first learned of you from hanging out at Northwind Manor, the meeting space and kind of hub for the Rabbit Room. You have fans among that crowd. And not long after hearing your name there, I was talking to somebody else, and they told me that you've pretty well floored a crowd that appeared for an Inkwell faith and arts gathering, and you really managed to move the folks there. Then I heard even more amazing news that you had been awarded the National Book Award for Young People's Literature for your novel, The Teacher of Nomadland. This was after a Newbery Award honor, a spiritual memoir, Everything Sad is Untrue. This after reviews in the New York Times and Washington Post, and in general, a lot of high praise and attention. So, my first question is, what have the last few months been like for you? It's not like you didn't get attention before, but I get the feeling that that's kind of intensified. So, how's life been?
Lovely. Golly, I'm sort of, I mean, it's been great. It's wonderful. I mean, the short answer is wonderful. Like, how could you not? I spent 15 years wishing people would read my stuff. And so to have them actually pay attention and what's more, give it sort of broadly positive feedback is just the dream. And to pretend anything otherwise would be to kind of take either an aloof position or just a needlessly dour position. And I don't ever want to do any of that. Like, it is without a doubt just glorious and gorgeous, and I'm thankful. And I mean that sincerely. It's hard to be as unmixed with your joy and not come off as if you're being somehow either insincere or fraudulent in some way. It's just been wonderful. There's nothing else. That said, I try to manage what I perceive as like a shutdown level of attention. Like, if we were ever in a party, you would hear my laugh from across the room. I would probably be eating more food than I should, and I would like it if everyone around me was laughing and we were telling stories, taking turns, and enjoying ourselves. But if you would like very quickly to silence me, just have the whole room turn and give me their attention, I would hate that. And so, for my taste and in general for my personality, positive or negative, attention is not the thing that gives me energy. It's the thing that, I have to put a lot of energy toward managing. And so, so often, positive or negative, without trying to come off as ungrateful, I do try to manage the amount I am aware of the attention. Because otherwise, I think I do have artist friends who come from theatrical backgrounds. They could wake up in the morning and read some great reviews and go click on and then like get more work done. If you were to have me read a positive or negative review in the morning, you could very well guarantee I would not get any work done the rest of the day, no matter what.
Well, there's a humility there, sounds to me.
Maybe. Yeah. Tim Keller used to say, like, it's people who think too low of themselves or just as self centered as people who think too highly of themselves. So, I probably err on all sides of that question, but I think it's really just this desire to kind of say, okay, like, I had a boss. I'll quickly tell the story because I love this story from Dinah Stevenson. She's the winningest children's book editor of her generation, right? Like, she's got more Caldecots and Newberries than you could count. And I just adored her. She passed recently. And I remember once I had started working for her and I had done this book that was, esoteric literary middle grade for kids. I was the editor of, and Kirkus, which is sort of a literary review, had excoriated this book. And like, I look back and I think, perhaps rightfully so, but it was a kind of review that I was dreading showing this first time author because I was thinking, like, she might never write again. It's that kind of review. And so,
Yeah.
and I went to Dinah and I said, Dinah, what do I do? Like, how, as an editor, do I write an email that basically says, hey, your first review is from probably the most literary, journal out there, and they think you stink. And she goes, well, tell her, what do they know? And I said, well, it's Kirkus. Like, what do you mean? What do they know? And she goes, well, you can tell her you don't ever have to pay attention to reviews And then I said, oh, okay, well, I'll just go do that. I thought she was going to be like, Daniel Nayeri, you've put our, solvency on the line here in this corporation. And so I said, okay, I'll go
That's
back.
awesome.
And as I was walking out the door, she added an addendum that I'll never forget. She said, but don't forget, if you tell her not to take in the bad ones, she can never believe the good ones. And I stuck with that. I said, okay, if I don't want to believe the bad ones, I can't believe the good ones, but at least I can keep working. And that,
That's very healthy. What
yeah,
a
and so
great
that's always been my
creative
kind of
practice.
I chose that path, I think.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, you've had a varied career, a lot of different flavors of creativity, as a friend of mine put it. Pastry chef, film writer, film producer, book editor, literary agent, and of course, author. How has creativity and living a creative life been just a priority for you?
I think everyone's fundamentally creating things at all times. I think the
Agreed.
question is what we've sort of habituated ourselves to create. But I know some people who can create an awkward situation better than any, like a master stroke of perfect social disaster. And there are folks who make it their art form to create great dinner parties. And
Yes.
on that front, I do think of creativity as any kind of muscle group. So I know plenty of people who could go to the gym and be sore for the next 5 years because they're just not used to it. And I think that's the same with creativity. I think there's plenty of people who are really out of practice and atrophied in it. But I suppose so on that front, I think of it as a practice. I think about it from a perspective of, if I was like one of these influencers trying to peddle mental hacks, one of the mental hacks I would offer is falling in love with being bad at things is one of the best things you could ever teach yourself. I think people who generally spend their time getting to an adult state and building a competency in whatever their career is going to be become sort of very allergic. Their ego becomes allergic to being bad at things. So if you were to say, hey, why don't you come with me to this boxing gym? The fact that they would be the worst person in that room makes them sort of allergic to that space. They do not want to experience incompetence anymore because it does feel pretty uncomfortable to begin with. But I think one of the things I try to tell my son all the time is your first practice is the most gain you'll ever get in any craft. And your second is the second most because these are just the leaps and falling in love with the distance of those leaps, even though you're going from incompetent to mildly less incompetent, um, is actually a skill you can fall in. So I'm starting. I do woodwork. I'm terrible if you assess me based on woodworkers, but I'm way better than I was when I didn't know the name of any saws, which was like, I don't know, 2 months ago. So great.
That's awesome.
It feels wonderful. It feels great to stink at things.
And Lamott, as we know, talks about valuing crappy first drafts,
There you go.
not being intimidated by those.
Yeah, and the joy of it. I think the first time you make anything half decent, whether you're carving wood or telling a story, it's just such a delightful experience. It's so you can have that forever. It's yours. Yeah. So I suppose I chase that in everything I'm up to.
And I think of you said, the practice of creativity, a couple ways to look at that is practice as in something we do habitually, but then practice as in something we do over and over again to get better at it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
There's a great book on this topic by Carrie Wallace called, The Discipline of Inspiration. And she kind of talks
well, I
about it
like
this way
that
as well.
title.
It's a great
Yeah.
title. It's a great book if you ever want to check it out, especially for an audience of creatives. She and I knew each other for a really long time. The like this, we share this kind of position toward, I think, toward the arts that there is quite a lot more discipline to it than I think people stereotypically derive. Yeah, it's a great book on that exact
It's
topic.
not always the muse mysteriously visiting us.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or even,
Yeah.
and I think she puts a really lovely, what is the word? She accounts for that, right? There is of course a shamanistic kind of quality to channeling, whether you call it a muse or just the lightning strike or the word of the Lord, certainly. But the discipline of having the craft to be able to, shape that is good. And so, anyway,
That's great.
yeah.
I'm picturing you living a quiet life in a small South Carolina town, neighborhood excursions on your motorcycle, cooking, baking, spending time with your family, engaging in kind of modest social media platforming, perhaps. I understand you do not have a smartphone.
Yeah,
Is
that's
that right?
true. I I was a
How does that make your life better? I mean, some of our listeners struggle with distractions. A lot of that has to do with technology and doom scrolling. So how do you guard that place for creativity?
Well, I mean, it's important to note that like I fail at it a lot. In the sense that I am deeply susceptible to doom scrolling. It's probably, one of my, top vices, if you will. I am an information junkie to begin with, but I love games. Distraction is very pleasant to me. And so, and I
Sure.
tend to be very dispositionally bothered by boredom. I'm sort of a perfect mixture for somebody who, like, I was day one on the iPhone when it first came out, all the initial sort of iPhone games and things like that. And so I think it's a matter of self-protection, of saying that, there was a period after about some odd years, I couldn't tell you, 6, I guess, but we'd gone through multiple iterations of the iPhone, and I sort of realized that I have a hour and a half commute every day on the subway, and I'm just playing, puzzles and stuff on there. And so what would happen? And so I tested it. I kind of, as with anything, I sort of encourage everyone just to, you know, test it on yourself. For me, I did that, and I wrote Everything Sad Is Untrue, which was sort of my first book. It was my 10th book to be published, but it was my first book that got any kind of attention. And I wrote that entire, like, this whole back half of that book in this 1.5 hour commute on the subway and on the bus
What a
into the
great
city.
story.
And so when it happened, all of a sudden there was this opportunity cost associated with my distraction. It wasn't just, well, I kind of like to calm down. I was going to work, for goodness sakes. I was working like 50, 60-hour weeks. It was a really busy, hard job. And so, it was easy for me to kind of say, what does it matter? I just want to do like my little whatever,
Sure.
Picross puzzles.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but once I was like, oh, you could dangle my dream in front of me and I could achieve it if I just put this stupid thing away. Uh, that that was a huge revelatory moment. And so for me, there's a very real cost that looks like. And so I try really hard to, I silo those things. But yeah, pretending that I'm kind of like pure on that topic is silly, or
Right.
that I,
But
you know,
you've made some discoveries
yeah.
and look at the fruit of what you experimented with. That's
And that, I
cool.
think, I mean, not to, that goes back to that discipline thought, right? Of like, you cannot have flights of fancy if your mind is just overloaded. You cannot, like, rest. What I thought of as boredom, a good masterful artist would think of as rest. And and that rest is where you're going to, be able to kind of recover your imaginative spaces. And so, yeah, so I kind of had to reorient everything around building silences. I'm not somebody who handles silence very well, but I, sort of, if you carve that in, then I could then fill it with my own creative work.
Great. Thank you for that. That's moving and helpful. Well, suffering is a key theme across your writing. Your mother certainly suffered for her Christian faith in Iran. Iran showed great bravery, which led to your own stories as a child, leaving your homeland, some years as a refugee, the losses, the ridicule, then coming to the States, living in Oklahoma, the misunderstanding, the suspicion, you're getting beat up at school, hard and harsh things go on in the world. And you very artfully talk about some of those hard and heartbreaking things that happened in your world. And yet you read through that story, Everything Sad Is Untrue, and it's uncomfortable in places because it's so vivid and authentic. But then it gets redeemed, which isn't to say that it's tied up neatly with a bow. But how does that conviction that God can redeem even those hard things, how does that grow out of your Christian faith?
How does it grow out of my Christian faith? I mean, it is my Christian
Yes.
faith. I think it is, we experience these like little redemptions
Yes.
that speak to the larger concept that I think is almost ineffably large for us to understand. Like I could never properly understand what I will feel like when after this life I look back and see what I have been. And here I am, sort of, broken and sort of flawed, and in a space that is broken and flawed,
Yes.
and what joy it must feel like to kind of look back. I think about that because my wife was telling me about this gentleman, a Scotsman, who wrote a particular hymn, and his life was so. Some of these hymn writers, their stories are so heavy in terms of suffering. Like, he was just in love with this woman, and they were young, and they were gonna get married, and they were riding horses together, and the horse throws his fiancee, and she dies, and he's just heart-stricken, and he goes to America, and his life is just so difficult, and over the years, and he's giving himself over to working with others. I'm sort of maybe butchering the story. She was just telling it to me yesterday, and I'm very quickly placing it here because I want to address
Yeah.
the end of it, which is
That's a
he
good
sort of falls
story.
in love again, and after years of this, and then she falls ill before they can be married and dies, and then he finds out his mother is ill in Scotland, and can't go back, and so he writes her a letter, and he writes her a hymn, and the hymn, if I remember correctly, was "Turn Your Eyes on Jesus," and you're like, the guy who wrote that hymn had that life.
Wow.
And there was a moment that the thought that struck me when she was telling me the story is, isn't it great how happy he is right now? He must be, for the last 100 years, laughing. I'm so pleased with the experience he's having now versus the experience he had before. And so that is fundamentally the core. And then sometimes we get these glimpses of it just in hearing these stories, right? Which is, for me, that was kind of yesterday. In life, in this moment, I think we get very small ones, but we can't possibly see what's on the other side.
That's personally moving to me. I tell a story about that very hymn
Yeah?
when my wife and I were engaged and some hard things happening, and she taught me to sing that hymn.
That's
And
beautiful.
it was what I needed to hear and what we as a couple needed to sing together. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. Well, and the small ones, right, is like the small traumas that we get to look back on. Like I'm not bothered. Sometimes people come to me and they'll apologize. They'll apologize as sort of these moments of childhood, which were full of knuckleheads, and I was one of them. The stories. As I continue to write, I'm going to participate in some of this knucklehead behavior as well, and so there's no one-sidedness to this guilt, but you look back on it and you just say, it bothers me none. And why is that? And it's like, well,
Amazing.
because a better life has happened since. These traumas don't have to be with us forever. These things do not need to carry. We don't need to be adults who are constantly working out little petty dramas of our childhood on the page or with each other. To me, this is a very small little freedom that, God gave me, and I'm thankful for, that is metonymy, right? Which is to say, a piece of a much larger thing for the much greater sort of redemption that we'll see. That's kind of that. It doesn't grow out of my faith. It's sort of
That
part and
is your
parcel
faith.
of it. Yeah.
Well, and to segue to my next question, what you've just said does that beautifully. The title
Mm.
for that middle grade memoir, which, by the way, is moving for every age, including this adult. The title, Everything Sad is Untrue, echoes, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien, favorite for many Rabbit Room folks. Sam Ganji says to Gandalf, I thought you were dead, but then I thought I was dead myself. Is everything sad going to come untrue? Maybe one of the most quoted lines in The Lord of the Rings. So while there are hard things that happen in your books, really, really challenging things, there's this strand of hope, which is to pick up a little bit that last question was, how does it get redeemed? And so I guess you've already anticipated this question, where does that hope come from?
Where
That
does
hope
the,
that everything sad ultimately will be untrue. Yeah.
I mean, Christ, only Christ. There's no other answer. I love this is the
Yeah.
Sunday
That's a
school.
good answer.
But I don't know.
Hard to beat.
I didn't catch on to the nuances of your question, but where is
But
the
where the hope
centrality
comes
and
from.
sort of root of my
Yeah.
hope? Well, I mean that I had a God who decided to come down to earth in human form and take my punishment for me. But otherwise, there is no hope. We all get what we deserve. We get what we deserve. And the harsh truth of that fact is that we all know what we deserve. So, yeah, I think I would be hopeless if not for that faith. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
we can go into it because I could talk about it forever, but there are no second answers. Like he's the A1 answer. I got nothing else. And in fact, when I lose sight of that, I am as a result deeply despondent a lot. So just to be clear.
Yeah. That's really well said. That hope has to come from somewhere other than mere circumstances. And to me, this is partly your craft and art. You did not write for a Christian audience. You wrote for an audience of all kinds of people. And yet you deftly weave in this hope that comes from Jesus. It's very clear that you write as a Christian. So anyway, that's just to say, well done and subtly done in a way, but winsomely and I think convincingly. Well, storytelling is having a moment in our culture. I think it has been, at least for a couple of decades. Somebody once said the memoir is crowding novels off the bestseller lists. You could debate whether that's the case or not.
Yeah, is that true?
I do
Huh.
think we're hungry. Storytelling and narrative interest is in the cultural air. You identify yourself as a modern Scheherazade,
Well, I sure don't.
hoping, huh?
I mean, I wish that would be great. That's like saying I identify as a modern Michael Jordan. And I was like, yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, it fits. It fits. And again, that was designed for a young people's audience, but it's moved so many adults. Because story is universal, maybe just say a sentence or two why you think we're so hungry for authentic stories.
Well, I think we're hungry for authentic stories for the exact reason that we're sort of spiritually adrift.
Mhm.
Meaning, so I was actually, I just wrote on this topic. I was an editor for, golly, 20 years. So I was working on other people's stories for a long time. And I'll tell you, that makes you more of an apologist for stories than being your own for the exact reason that you have to write this 20-page letter, right? You get the first draft. And before
Wow.
what people think editing is, which is, going in and fixing a joke here or there, or they misused regardless, one has to actually write an editorial letter, which is sometimes a 20 to 30-page letter
Wow.
that kind of addresses the larger points, what you think of as the global edits. And that's the moment where the editor and the writer are really digging in. And you're having conversations around, what is the story about, and should the whole last section happen, and is this really a story that needs to be in the first person as opposed to the second person? These questions are they're quite large, and also you'll often get authors who would like to argue with you about it, and because you're not the arbiter of correctness here. So you get into these conversations that were the most fruitful conversations of my career. And out of that was born a lot of my thinking on storytelling. So I wrote this book called How to Tell a Story, which is kind of my 101 on the topic. It's kind of my creative writing workshop. And the reason I bring
Awesome.
this up is because there's a chapter on conflict and motivation and dialogue. And the chapter on motivation is me trying to express to early writers. This is very much trying to pitch to someone who's like, let's sit down and let's write. Let's just write as many times as we can, sort of work out this imaginary muscle and imaginative muscle.
Mhm.
And And so in the question of what is my 101 speech on motivation, very quickly we get to the first principles of how we even look at others. Right? We say, okay, what is motivation? The motivation is what someone wants more than anything else in the world. Actually, it's not what they want more than anything else in the world. That's the first item in their motivation chart. The rest is a list of priorities because we all have a ton of wants. We're not made up of one want. We want all kinds of things, immediate gratification and short-term and long-term goals and all this sort of things. And so we all have this list. And that list fundamentally is not just from a character's perspective, what gets them moving along the plot. It's also what makes their ethical framework. It is how we judge each other. If we have a character who is stepping over her grandmother to get that promotion at work, we judge her for it, and rightfully so. So we not only determine the nobility of a character based on this list of priorities, but we also understand the entire morality of the world based on the depiction of this, set of goals. And so we fundamentally are looking at this and going, oh, this is what Augustine talks about. This is the idea of ordered and disordered love. And to
Yes.
see a character struggle to order their love properly is the work of a story, is the work of a novel. And so I think our fascination with this is built on the fact that we're adrift ethically, and we have no moral compass. And stories are a place where we simulate moral compasses and ask ourselves, is this it? And I think for people who are not, especially for people who are not necessarily tethered or tied to a particular faith tradition, or people who have sort of rejected that, I think storytelling is the only place where they can simulate that thought over and over and over again. And as a result, there's never been a worse time for terrible stories.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you once said, I love it when characters miscommunicate or misunderstand one another.
Yeah,
And I also think of somebody who said the shortest distance between two people is a story.
that's good.
Yeah. But I think the point you're making about how we mess up our human relating and get our communication garbled and even wars get started out of perceived slights. I think the teacher of Nomadland has that undercurrent. Would you agree that over the last few years we've gotten more fractured as a culture? I'm talking about the West, America, North America, primarily, but not limited to that. Would you say we've gotten more prone to misunderstanding and polarizing and off in our silos, not really reaching beyond the barriers? And if so, how do you see your story helping?
These are good questions. Yes. So start with misunderstanding. I mean, those are my favorite things anyway, from a craft perspective, right? Like the greatest episodes of Frasier and of course Shakespeare, any of these kind of comedies of errors where great mistakes are happening, and to be able to layer that. I mean, the fastest way to make me sort of admire a writer is to put that in front of me. I think it's the hardest stuff to do properly and well. And so yeah, so I do think of that kind of sort of broadly spoken comedy as delightful at the same time as speaking to these deeper and maybe more fraught topics of did you notice how silly Benedict and Beatrice were? They almost became sworn enemies, and then they end up in love for all time. Isn't it interesting that,
Common story. Yeah.
yeah, we're kind of always teetering on this line. Of course, I think anybody watching would be silly to think that the internet has had a salubrious effect on our communication. I think one of the things that my generation and younger will do, I'm bullish on this front. I think one of the things we will do is figure out communication networks that are fundamentally offline. And if we don't, then I do agree that what we are mediating our interaction through will always build miscommunication, misprision, friction, and damage. So yeah,
I love that. Yeah.
but I am always bullish on humanity's ability to course correct. I think we've been driving toward a cliff and a million cliffs since forever. But I am always bullish on the next generation looking at us and our silly ways and realizing where the corrections are much easier. And I think that is something that generation will absolutely do. which is to say the generation that's, let's say, in high school and college now. I think they will realize that offloading every one of their relationships onto a platform was a disaster, and that people lost friendships over the dumbest things. My generation will be, I think, the generation that knows itself as having severed ties over things that we can look back on even now that we're 5, 6, 10 years old and go, oh, so you guys lost your friendships over Occupy Wall Street? Do you remember? Do
Yeah.
you remember that 2 week period
Yeah.
in our American culture? Like, it's a perfectly valid moment to have talked about, or to look back on, But to have lost a friendship over it now, after many of its, salient points are fundamentally behind us. Not that its larger points are behind us, but that it's particular moment, right? We can all point to these moments. We can all point to any one of them and realize I probably shouldn't have dropped my 15-year relationship over this. But it's sort of hard to do now. It's hard to recover. So, yeah, I'm very excited about the fact that we are just going to simply redefine communication. And
That's
sort of,
very, very hopeful, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the alternative is violence, which
Yeah.
is, I
Which
guess,
we're
if
seeing too
anybody.
much of. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think if you have people you love who are weaker than you, if we were to say like violence, and I'm from, again, a group of people who are like, okay, do you like your chances? Let's build a little tribe of super warriors and see what happens in sort of a Mad Max post-apocalyptic horror show. But if you have anybody you love, and I think most people do, or if you understand your actual chances, then I think you should realize that that's not a good alternative, and that we can get there. Actually, again, I am not that naive, by the way, when it comes to other topics around the nature of force. But I think on the topic of communication, I think I am.
Well, so you talk about a God who speaks. This is getting
Speaking of
theological.
which,
A God who speaks, a God who listens. How many religious traditions stress one over the other, but really to answer our deepest human longings and have healthy societies, we need both. The restlessness, you mentioned Augustine, the restlessness Augustine talked about that will only find its rest in God. How does genuine faith make us expectant for a God who will not only speak, but also listen, and out of that interchange show that he cares?
well, yeah. So I think this is the paradox of the Christian faith that makes it, I think, so rich and interesting to understand. Because I think of this metaphor of like the listening and the speaking as like, think of them as hyper broadly, like the one who has agency, right? The speaker, the like we could get very theological with concepts of logos, right? But like just the one who gets to declare. Let's just like
Yeah.
say that. And let's call that speaking and listening, or let's call it like agency. And you look at the Old Testament and the New, and you look at, faiths across the world, you look at sort of even your interaction. And in the book, for a young narrator, that metaphor extrapolates into the nature of the novel, right? The novelist is the only one who gets to speak. You never get to speak to a novelist or the narrator, let's say. The narrator speaks, you listen. And if you'll note, our narrator in everything, we're talking now about Everything Sad is Untrue, which is kind of my memoir book, but it's also a book about a narrator who doesn't really know how to be a narrator because, and this extrapolates further to what feels like an asymmetrical experience of being a refugee in a country, right? Of being a guest who's only taking, and he wishes more than anything else to be a guest who's also giving. And to be a good guest, to be welcomed. Because, in my opinion, and this is a topic in the United States as well, is that we need to figure out what the obligations are. By the way, we should not be shy about figuring out what the obligations are for everyone. And this is what he's worried about. He's saying to himself, gosh, I want these people to welcome me. How do I do that without hearing them? Like, there's nothing more rude than a guest who only speaks. But here he is with a microphone in the form of a narration. And so he's trying very hard to break the concept of a novel. Over and over again, he's talking to the reader. He's like soliciting your response, even though, of course, you can't give it.
I was struck by that, by repeatedly you reach out to the reader, you ask for patience, you
Yeah.
say, well, I may not get this right, or as I unspool this complicated story, hang in there with me.
Yeah.
You were very explicit in using that as a device. And I
Yes.
think it worked.
Thank you. It's very much built on that same framework, right? Of he doesn't understand and he doesn't feel I mean, it takes a particular, I don't know if I would call it arrogance, but it takes a particular kind of confidence, maybe a teacher's confidence, to know that you need to lecture for 3 hours because all 3 of those hours is going to be information delivered to the students because they don't have it. Right? That's a narrator's job. He's very nervous about that. He doesn't
Yes.
know if he wants to take that on, and he doesn't know if you're willing to give it to him because he's not that great. And so, out of that humility of this little young man who's trying to do this, is born this narration that is trying so hard to speak and to listen. And out of that metaphor is built this idea of, wait a minute, why do we think God should ever listen to us? Like, why do we think that? That's such a silly thing. Shouldn't the faiths that basically say, shut up, listen, just deliver the commandments from the top of the mountain? And like the idea that any of us think that God should pause his breath so that then we can bring something to the table. Some interesting thought that he's never had. Some lovely suggestion to the way things are going. Like, isn't it funny and hilarious and completely out of pocket for us to believe this? And yet, the Christian faith discusses that no, actually, God does not simply dictate the law, although he also dictates the law. And he also does not simply sit back and love you so much that you can sit there forever pouring and having the agency, and you do not get the microphone the whole time. You just don't. But in prayer, right? In prayer, we speak and hopefully we say, thy will be done. And also, of course, we are told and have the opportunity to listen because we know our God speaks as well. And I think that is just a mind-bogglingly amazing thing that God offers. I think it's utterly unique. And I think novels should spend a lot of time trying to parse it out and explore it.
That's so well said. You disarm the reader when you do that. And I would say God becomes even more winsome and worthy of love and devotion when God says, I'm not going to just speak, but I'll listen.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. I think about this all the time because when you think about things like Trinity and this idea of like, why would God want my worship? Why does that have any value at all? Like he has the actual worship of better things than me better.
Yes. He's
But
complete in and of himself. He doesn't
right.
need
Isn't that
us.
fascinating? He has no need,
Yeah.
but at some point he hands me the microphone and says, "Would you like to sing for a minute?" So yeah, and you've sort of properly kept us in the right theological framework of course he is complete in his own self. That is not at
Yes.
all what I'm saying. That
Right,
we do
right,
not have
right.
an equal contribution in speaking and listening.
Yes.
Never been the point I was making.
But it makes the grace all the more remarkable
Yeah,
that he does. Yeah.
yeah, it's shocking.
Yeah, it should be. Daniel, thank you so much. I was moved by what I read and just as moved, perhaps even more so, talking with you through the glories of technology. Thank you so much. Your warmth and insight really came through.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I know. Hopefully, I'm going to be at the next Rabbit Room Hutchmoot, so I'll be excited to
That's
connect
that's
with you.
what I hear.
That's right.
I'm so excited.
All right. Well, have a good one till then.
Thank you